make sure that it's going. There we go. Perfect. All right. Well, hello everyone. Happy Monday. I appreciate you taking your lunch break and spending it with us. I hopefully you all can see my screen. I'll try to check back in on my other screen, make sure that it's working. But our topic that we're just going to be chatting a little bit about today is the topic of working with and not for our communities. So, this has been a topic that has kind of been on my mind a lot, as I know that, through some conversations that I had and some sessions I went to at the Now conference, there's some other things I've been reading and learning about in community development and engagement. This has been something that I think in our work in Main Street is very important. And I also think that we're set up for it in a really powerful way. And so, really, we're just going to talk through what it looks like to take this more holistic approach to downtown revitalization, and really just a holistic approach to the work we do for Main Street and making sure that it's coming out of our community's vision, and not just our own vision or just our board's vision, but that it's our community is kind of bringing in their input to the table as well. So, as always, some housekeeping. Feel free to send questions. I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between screens, so I'll make sure to leave time at the end for any discussion points or thoughts. Really, this is just a more higher level conversation. It's less, I know some of our webinars are more practical. We have a lot of here's a list of things you can be doing, or here's an example of this. This one's just something that I want to get your wheels turning on. I want you to think about what this might look like in your community. And so with that, I'm always curious to kind of hear what are the areas around this topic that you're thinking about or things that you have seen work or not work in your community. And so I hope it just starts kind of getting you thinking about this. As always, this is recorded, and it'll be housed on our YouTube channel. So if this is something you want to come back to or share with your board, or other board members, you can do that. So here's some of the things we're going to be talking through today. First of all, as always, what does with and not for even mean? And why should this be our approach to the work that we do? How does this connect into the Main Street approach and our accreditation? So even if you're here today and you're an Okra's downtown affiliate member, and maybe you don't follow necessarily all of the standards of accreditation that our IAMs and NOMs do, I still think it's an important thing to look at, and again, a good framework to go back to. So we'll kind of look at that quickly. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about what does it look like to run a successful community meeting, and even more so, what are some ways we could go about having a successful community meeting. Again, I think this looks different depending on your community, what you're trying to achieve, but we're just going to talk through some different ideas. And then talk a little bit about honing in on those facilitating skills and creating an open space within your organization. And then I'll just talk through a couple different examples you could look more into, again, if you want to keep kind of diving into this topic, as well as wrap up any other questions, all that good stuff. So I learned my lesson last time, and I'm not going to do a poll on Teams because they didn't go very well. But I would be curious while I continue on presenting. I would be curious to know for you all, when you want to get community input on a project that you're doing, or maybe the city is doing a project and you're kind of at the table for that, and they're wanting to get input, what do you all do to get this community input, to get your residents, business owners, all of your different people in your community? How do you get their input on a project, or a problem that needs to be solved? I would just be curious, and maybe it's something that you've done that's really worked well, or maybe you're like, well, we don't really do that at all. We kind of just make the decision and then put it out to them for their response. Be as honest as you want, but if anyone feels comfortable to share that in the chat, I might come back to those responses at the end, just so we can kind of talk through some examples from you all. So feel free to do that if you want to. So what does with and not for even mean? So as I've kind of this has been a topic that has just been super interesting to me lately. Really what it's looking at is that we can often forget, because we're out doing this work every single day. We see the needs of our community, of our downtown specifically, and our work as Main Street. We know kind of what needs to be done. We have our work plans. We're kind of moving and grooving. And sometimes what can happen is we can lose sight of the fact that there are a lot of people standing outside of our boardroom or of our, places where our committees meet who are impacted by our decisions. And so, again, for us, that might mean kind of some of our main stakeholders, like our business owners, our building owners, community partners, but it also means residents. The work that we do, the decisions we make, it affects people in the community. And so, really, this conversation is talking about instead of just doing things for the community, because I think that's something that we'll often say. I do this to help people. I do this because I want to serve my community and do things for them, which is great. I think that is such an important an amazing thing that all of you, do this work because you're passionate about it and definitely because you're passionate about it because it is not an easy job. But with that, sometimes we start to do things for people and we kind of get into a rhythm and say, okay, we're going to do a mural. All right, we're going to do this project. Okay, we're going to do this. And we sometimes forget to take a step back and say, wait, is this really what our community wants? Is this what they need? And so we kind of forget to say, hey, come in and have a seat at the table. Let's do this together with your input, excuse me, instead of just saying, this is what we're going to do. And so that really goes into my next point, which is everyone does deserve a seat at the table. One of the things I love is that Main Street America often uses a phrase of like, Main Street is for everyone. And that's true. The work that you do is supposed to be accessible by the entire community, every group, every person, all of that, everyone should be able to access it. And so, if that's true, then also we want to make sure that we're bringing voices to the table to be able to hear and engage them in the work that we're doing. And that can be a really powerful thing when we actually give people the chance to have their voice heard. It can also be really difficult. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit with, there's always the naysayers. There are the people who don't agree. And yes, even them we want at the table. So it's definitely not an easy thing to do, but it's important. And then lastly, downtown progress can't happen without this community engagement piece. So here's the great thing is that Main Street organizations are already so well equipped for this because the way that our organizational structures are, with our board members being people in the community, with our committees being people in the community, hopefully. So hopefully you have a wide swath of people that you've been able to grab to bring onto your board. This is why we stress, and I'll talk a little bit about this with accreditation, but this is why we stress so much having a diverse board that is bringing in all different kinds of people from your community, not just the same 10 people that are on every single board. We want to bring in different people. We want people to sit on your committees who maybe haven't had the chance to have a leadership opportunity in the community. The reason we emphasize that so much is because for this reason exactly, because those being able to have those people on your committees creates a community engagement and engages them in the development of downtown. It lets them have a role in transforming your downtown and being a part of that change. And so that is the great thing is that Main Street is already really set up for this. We have great partnerships with people. So through our partnerships, being able to really reach a lot of different people in the community. And so this is something that I think is, again, some organizations that might do community development, they might have to work and kind of rework their structure sometimes. Whereas for Main Street, this is a really natural thing. We just have to make sure that it stays a priority because just like anyone, we can, again, kind of get focused in our own lane and forget we need to bring some people in to the conversation. So, a little bit about the why I think this conversation is important, but also why I think it can be helpful to you. I already said this earlier, but it can't always be the same 10 people making decisions on behalf of insert your population of your community. This tends to happen, especially, and I know in conversations with people, they're like, well, we're a really small community and it's hard to get, more than these 10 people. And I understand. There's not everybody is going to want to necessarily be on a board or even be on a committee. And so that is why creating opportunities where community members and people in your community can just come and have their voice heard is so powerful, because they might not want to serve on a board yet or serve on one of your committees yet, but they might be willing to come to a 1 hour meeting where you provide some snacks and they can come and have their voice heard, maybe about a thing that they might be really passionate about or they might really care about. They just, maybe they don't feel confident enough to really say, I feel like I can be a board member or committee member. Plus, they might not know anything about your organization. And I'll get into the education piece a little bit later. But all this to be said is that we have to make sure that, again, the whole what I've seen happen a lot in communities, just as I've been out talking to them, is that sometimes, those same 10 people that are on all the boards, they also have seats at the table for large community decisions. So if there's going to be a huge streetscape project, or if there's going to be, whatever it might be, those kind of 10 people are being talked to. But if those people aren't also bringing in people in their own areas of influence, so Main Street, again, looking at our stakeholders, business owners, building owners, anyone who's really downtown, if we're not, continually engaging them and letting them have their voice be heard, then it starts to just become these same 10 people and everyone's like, yeah, okay, this seems right. Yeah, like, let's do this. And we forget that there's a bunch of other people sitting out in the community who are going to be affected by this decision probably. Or if you're trying to solve a problem, there might be people who have some really, really good, helpful answers to those problems. So that is why this is really important. Probably the most important is that we just have to get out of that, kind of same group of people sitting at the table. I also was thinking of, it's important to kind of think of the transformation strategy approach. So for those of you who have gone through transformation strategy, you kind of know that a big part of that process is a lot of community engagement and just community feedback. And as I was kind of building out this presentation, I kept thinking about a lot of those transformation strategy visits. And for those of you who don't know much about transformation strategies, essentially Main Street America comes in to one of our communities. Prior to them coming in, they grab a bunch of market data. They also they send out a survey to the Main Street organization to send out to the entire community. And that survey hits on all different kinds of things, like what do you want to see downtown, and would you ever live downtown, and asks all these different kinds of questions. And then once they'll bring all that data to the community, and then they talk to the board committees, and then they also talk to business owners, building owners, and other community partnerships, and they do that through focus groups. And so that whole process, how that strategy comes to be, is built out of a lot of community engagement. And so I was thinking about this a lot because I think it's really easy when we start opening ourselves up to really engaging our community in these decisions. It's easy to kind of quickly shut down because often what happens is we hear a lot of negativity, a lot of naysayers, or people who, once we start telling people they can have their voice heard, the loudest ones tend to be the most negative. And so what we often tell people when we're, out doing these transformation strategy visits is, yes, sometimes it can be really frustrating. And yes, sometimes it is a perception issue. A lot of times they'll be like, well, of course they think so and so this is an issue. It's because they probably don't ever come downtown, they don't, their perception is off. And that might be true, but also that doesn't mean that their experience or their opinion is any less valid. And I think there are ways to actually engage those conversations where you might be able to change not all, but some of your biggest naysayers, and through good engagement skills, actually get them on your team and even maybe get them to be a more positive minded person about downtown, or maybe now they kind of understand what you have been doing to help address these issues. So there's some ways that you can do that, but it made me think of transformation strategies. And again, for those of you who have been through that, I know that it's hard sometimes to hear, again, some of the negative things, but it's also important because it does help lead you to a more specific approach to the work that you do. And then lastly, I think we have to think through how we ask questions and engage our specific community. So I do think that what I'm going to talk through today and just some of the ideas that I'm throwing out there, I'm still learning. I'm still kind of figuring out, some different approaches to take with this. But with that, it's going to look different in every community. It's not always going to be a one size fits all. And with that, I think it's going to look different depending on who you're talking to and what you're trying to achieve. So there might be times when, if it's more project based feedback, that's going to be maybe a different structured conversation than if you just want to bring in a bunch of people to help kind of problem solve an issue that you're facing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think those are just some reasons why this work is really important. Just because we want to be able to do work that really impacts our community. And when I say community, I know us specifically, we're thinking our focus is downtown, and that is true. But so impacting downtown, impacting your stakeholders, but that ultimately does trickle out. It impacts your residents. It impacts the people who will come downtown and shop, who might live downtown or might eventually live downtown or whatever it might be. So just remembering that too. Okay, so how does this topic kind of tie into our accreditation and the Main Street approach? So as I was kind of looking through specifically with some of the accreditation standards, this topic, I think, really can tie into many of the accreditation standards just because, really, at the end of the day, like I said earlier, this is what Main Street is all about. It's about engaging the community. It's about really, it's a grassroots effort, right, to revitalize our downtowns, to help us be entrepreneurial, these ecosystems of really strong business and all of these things. Well, that can't happen without the push from your community. And so it it overlaps in a lot of different of the accreditation standards, but the two that really stuck out to me were standard 1 and standard 2. So standard 1 talks all about broad-based community commitment to revitalization. And so just like that sounds, it's talking about all those kinds of things like, bringing people and into this, basically having good partnerships, strong partnerships across your community. Are you bringing people in? Do you have a seat at the table? Do they have a seat at your table? All of those kinds of things. And I think this really, again, really makes a difference in the work that we do when this is strong, when we have good partnerships, when we're kind of leaning on others. And ultimately, you have that commitment to this work that you're doing because you have to have that. You have to have people who are in your corner. You have to have volunteers. And so that leads well into standard 2, which talks all about inclusive leadership and organizational capacity. Which this standard especially talks all about that, having a diverse board, bringing people in, all different kinds of people, making sure that your community is represented in your organization. And so I think both of these, if you're curious to kind of want to know where that tie-in happens, I would definitely say dig into both of those a little bit more and really think through, what are we missing here with this? Where could we be doing a better job? And how can we be bringing in more people that to really represent the entirety of our community? And so that even means looking at things like your demographics and really saying, okay, and not, again, not just even on your board, or yes, I mean that's great on your board and on your committees, but again, are you having opportunities for people just to come and have their voices heard? Or is your city or other people you work with, are they doing that? And if not, maybe that's something that would be a really good way to kind of help engage some of those other people that maybe currently aren't represented in your organization, or you don't get to hear their voices very often. When it comes to the approach, or the 4-point approach, and we look at all 4 different of the points, I think that this really, the way that this looks in each of those. So for organization, volunteer recruitment. So, I think we have to remember that in the work that we do, if we're giving people an opportunity to come and have a seat at the table and have their voice heard, and we actually listen and actually try to implement solutions or projects with their input, that is a great volunteer recruitment skill because those are the kinds of organizations that people are going to trust. They're going to want to, yeah, come back, serve with you even, maybe even be on a committee and say, wait, I didn't realize this was the kind of work that you do. After I went after I came to this meeting to give my feedback and you use that opportunity to educate them a little bit about Main Street, that's a great volunteer recruitment tool. And, now they understand more of the work you do. So it really is hopefully a win-win. Um, and under promotion, to me, this can tie into our kind of events and marketing. And I think with this, it just means the way that you're talking about yourself. So whether that's, at events, you're out talking to people, or the way you actually put yourself out there on social media or other marketing mediums. Are you making yourself accessible to people? Are you, again, kind of using that as an opportunity to really bring others into the conversation, connecting with people, at your events, I bet you get a huge swath of different kinds of people from your community that come to those. So are you sending, maybe a board member or two out to kind of talk to people, get some feedback, really kind of check in with them. If you're trying to kind of gain some momentum or want input on a project, using your events and your marketing mediums to do that. Economic vitality. So this, to me, and with this topic, we're looking at things like our business owner relationships, as well as building owners, really any of your kind of like key stakeholders, and just continually looking at ways to build that up. So if one of our biggest priorities in Main Street is to support our small businesses in our district. And so with that, are you continually opening up ways for them to come and give feedback and input? And I know, again, that can be hard. And we have a whole nother webinar on building business owner relationships that Abby Huff did a while ago. That's on our YouTube page. I definitely encourage you to go back and look at that. But thinking through ways, I know especially with property owner relationships, that can be really hard because, first of all, some of them don't even live in your community. But for the ones who do, are you finding a way to kind of get them to take a seat and talk to you, or give feedback? And I mean beyond just a survey or beyond just you pass them and say, "Hey, what do you think about this project?" Or it's more of an intentional conversation. And it also is project-based feedback. So because our main stakeholders with Main Street, usually the people most impacted by the work we do, again, our work does impact all of our community, but the people that are really impacted by it are our business owners and our building owners, because really any of the work that we do, if we have an event downtown, that affects business owners. If we do facade grants, that affects building owners, all and business owners. So a lot of the work we do affects them. And so sometimes I think, especially when we're having large projects, or if we get a grant for something, or we kind of just are like, well, we know we want to do this, or yeah, our board talked about it and we want to do this. And sometimes I think it's good to take a step back and think, okay, have we actually what do we have to support that beyond just, maybe a few of us wanting to do this? Is that actually what the community wants? Is that actually what our stakeholders, how will this impact them? If we're putting up 4 new murals, that's really exciting, but maybe we need to bring in the community, bring in some of those stakeholders to hear their input on what should those murals be? Where should they go? How does this impact them? All of those kinds of conversations. And then with design, again, property owner relationships, and then as well as having accessible design. And so I think with this conversation, it just means, again, going back to that mural example, thinking about the projects that we're doing. Design can be a lot of different things, can be all the way from flower pots to preserving a historic building. But in all of the work that we do, making sure that we're really educating, number one, so that people understand why we're doing some of these design projects, why we're putting up wayfinding signage, why behind what you're doing, but also making sure, again, that there's input. If you are putting up a huge business district map, make sure that maybe you've got some business owners who have looked at it or given you feedback to it. So it really can fit into a lot of the work that we do. And again, going back to that, this is all very committee and volunteer driven, the work that we do. And so that's great, because that ultimately is the first step of community engagement. Is you already have some people who serve on your committees, or is just a one-off volunteer that maybe comes and helps here and there, that represent someone in the community, represent maybe, different people in the community that can come and help give this feedback. So that's a great start. But then I'm just going to push you to think even beyond just our typical structure, and talk a little bit about how we can also invite people in to have those conversations. Um, so Liz spoke at Main Street Now and one of the plenary sessions in Boston. And she does such amazing work. At the end, I have some examples. And one of them is just getting on her website. And I would encourage you to dig around and read some of the case studies of the work that she's done, because she really has taken this approach to community engagement and decisions that are being made. And she does it in such a powerful way where she ensures that everybody in the community is like heard and that they are respected throughout the process, and that it just is really cool. But I really loved this quote. I probably butchered it a little bit because it was written down when I heard her speak, but she says that there's kind of a difference between doing good and doing right. And so doing good is usually about us, which is not always, it doesn't mean it's always bad or that we have bad intentions. It just means that sometimes it can be a little bit more self-focused, but it's not always serving our people the best way. So sometimes I think we get, in the any kind of work that we do, but I think in Main Street it can happen. We look at the work that we do and we're like, we're doing good. We're changing the way that our downtown looks. We're helping businesses, and that's all true. But we also have to make sure, again, is the work that we're doing kind of just now a bubble of people making decisions, or are we actually serving our people, the people in our community who we get to represent? Them. And so she kind of says doing right is for others, and we can't say the work is done until they say it's done. And that's hard. I mean, even when she said that, when I heard her present, I was like, oh, like that feels like a hard pill to swallow, because again, in our work, and by the way, I'm not saying any of this is easy or that it's something that you can be like, yep, okay, that makes sense. I think that this takes a lot of time and practice to get to the point where we say, we might think the work is done, or say, okay, this project's good, yeah, this is what we wanted to do. But you might get people who say, that's actually not what we wanted something different. Maybe we wanted this, or we wanted it to look this way. Or you thought you solved a problem, but then come to find out that maybe you didn't fully solve it. And so this quote, I really like it, those, because I think this is what this really all boils down to, is kind of shifting our mindset and thinking, how do we make sure that people's voices are being heard, so we know if the work isn't done? We know the work is never really done, but just in general, thinking of on a project or problem solving basis. So when we think about that, the next thing we have to think about is, again, kind of getting out of our typical Main Street structure, because again, I think the way that we're structured really lends well to this. So lean on your committees, lean on your board members. They do represent your community. So make sure you're listening to all of their voices. But then when we think beyond that, there might be certain decisions, and this might not just be in your Main Street organization. This might also be that maybe you all as an organization do this really well, but you're noticing that maybe the city doesn't. Maybe the municipality is making a lot of really quick decisions about things, and there's not a lot of community input. So then there's a lot of maybe angry feelings from business owners or downtown building owners, or just residents in general. And so maybe this is information too that you can help continue to think through. And if you have a seat at the table with them saying, hey, have you ever thought about maybe before we jump into this next construction project or this next big change in our community, maybe thinking through what the community needs with this, or how this might impact people. And so I think that what that comes down to is running a successful community meeting. And what I mean by community meeting is this can mean and maybe it's just an hour long, you're bringing people in, you just kind of like a focus group type style. It might be something where you've kind of asked them, hey, would you be willing to come every 2 months on a Tuesday night and, work on helping us solve this X problem. Maybe there's a big problem downtown and you're like, we need some outside voices, some people to come help us address this. So it can look a lot of different ways. But ultimately, again, the whole point of it being that it's a community meeting, it's an open meeting. It's not just your board, it's not just those same 10 community partners that come to everything. Instead, you've actively reached out and brought other people to the table. So, one of the things that I've kind of been learning about in terms of just facilitation and having these kind of really successful community engagement meetings is something called design thinking. Some of you probably know a lot about design thinking. It's a newer concept to me, and I heard about it kind of in the context of community engagement. But it really is, it fits a lot of different types of work, and it just kind of has recently been something that I think people have started to implement in the community development world. And so when you look, I would encourage you to look up and kind of dig into design thinking. I think this stuff is super fascinating to learn about. So if you do as well, I would encourage you to do a Google search, look at all the different kinds of graphs and ways that people go about this in their work. This is just one example. Of kind of the design thinking process. But one thing with this process that I want to kind of emphasize is number one, I am not a trained facilitator in this process, nor am I an expert. And so this is just, again, an idea of something that I wanted to kind of throw out to you all to get you to start thinking of maybe there are some different ways we can approach the way that we're getting input from the community. So if you've just been sending surveys, for example, surveys aren't a bad thing. They're really effective. I mean, we send them all the time. But I will say, typically, I know for us as a coordinating program, once in a while we'll tap on some of your shoulders and say, hey, can we hop on a call and can we get your feedback on if we were to do this potential project, or can we get your feedback if we did this, or how did you think this went? Sometimes we do that, and honestly, we get the best, I don't know, feedback and results when we do that versus sometimes just sending a survey. Because surveys, they can capture some really helpful information, but they also, there's only so much you can get out of them. And sometimes I think what happens is we do a project without really getting any input. And then we send a survey saying, what did you think of the project? And I think sometimes people just don't like it simply because they weren't asked to give their opinion on it. And so, and again, there are different situations where, you might have a really specific type of grant that you have to do a very specific kind of project. I'm not saying that this has to be every single thing you ever do. That would slow you down a lot. But think about those projects again that are really going to impact people, impact your stakeholders. And those might be the ones that are worth you saying, maybe it would be good to bring in some additional voices. Kind of for us to hear the community input before we move forward doing this project. Or maybe, again, maybe it's not you, maybe it's the city level or another organization that you can bring some of these ideas to. So all this to be said, the design thinking process, I am not an expert, but this is kind of the flow of it typically. One thing I definitely want you to notice on this graph is that it bounces around to different ones, as you can kind of see on this. So it's not necessarily a very linear process. This makes it look very linear. But from what, as I've been kind of reading about it, it's really that you kind of go with the flow of what your group is trying to achieve. So the first thing is you're kind of thinking through what are the goals out of our meeting. So let's say that it is you got grant money to do 4 new murals in your community, and there's no certain guidelines. These murals can be whatever you want them to be. You have the money to hire the artist. The artist is, open, bring them into the conversation as well. But, there might be some pushback from building owners. There might be some even pushback from building owners. But you also know that you want to get some more community input. Instead of just kind of going out and doing the murals, you might say, I want to know what our community really wants to see in terms of the art, what it represents, our cultural heritage, all of those different pieces that we have to kind of think about when we're doing murals. And so if that's if your goal, you have to kind of think through what are my specific goals, and go into that meeting, again, have snacks, have things to kind of draw people in. That's the other piece, is that if we're doing community engagement well, we're going to have to kind of get creative. And this is the part that I think takes time, doesn't happen overnight. But you have to build those relationships with other. So if there are people in the community that you're like, I want to hear their opinion or the way that this might impact them or their voice in this project, but maybe I don't really have a connection to them, start asking around, start asking your board. If there's a group in your community, for example, that is Hispanic or doesn't speak English, think through, do we need to create some of our flyers in a different language, in their whatever their language is? If we want them to kind of be able, do we need to have a translator? If we want them to be able to come to our meeting and for us to hear their voices as well in this decision. So you really have to start getting creative and sometimes go out of the box and try and fail and then try again. And so there's a lot of that in this, but I think it's important to think through, how do you bring in a lot of different people? But going back to the meeting setting, I definitely think having food is a great way to bring people together, and kind of open up people, relax them a little bit, all of that. And I'll talk about that in a second as well. But so yeah, talk through your goals with the people at the beginning of the meeting. If you know that your goal is to, determine at least what maybe the theme of these 4 murals, or maybe you just want to determine where they're going to go, or whatever it might be, make that really clear and say, we brought you here because we want to understand, which is kind of this first bubble, and kind of observe and gain a point of view. That's kind of that inspiration part of the meeting, is we want to understand where you're coming from. We want to understand how we can do this in a way that serves our entire community well. So we wanted to bring your voice in so that, we can do this in the best way possible. And I think it's good at the beginning to create that kind of rapport with them, saying, I understand if, maybe you don't feel great about us doing this, or you might feel negative about it, or whatever, using good open language about it. Either way, though, kind of really from the start creating that this is a space where we want to hear that. We want to be respectful of each other, but we do want to hear your thoughts. And so let's figure out a way to have an open conversation about it. And so really the best way too is to have a neutral facilitator. And I'll talk about that also in a moment. But yeah, just trying to be as neutral as you can, which I know is hard for projects that matter a lot to us. But if we want to really get actual feedback, we need to even be okay listening to some of the naysayers. And when I heard somebody presenting on this topic of engaging community members and kind of working with them versus for them, there was like an example that this woman I was listening to speak on it shared, that she said that she saw this being really effective in bringing over some of those naysayers, because what this whole process does is it also puts them into action. So yes, you're going to hopefully come out with some tasks for your design committee or whoever's going to be working on those murals, but it also gives them an opportunity to say, okay, is this something, like, you seem to really care about this? Like, this is something that you obviously, you feel passionate about, even if they're negatively passionate about it. Inviting them in and saying, would you want to continue to be a part of it? And this woman was saying how she got to see over and over again how there were several people that all of a sudden, just because they were heard and because they had been invited to have a seat at the table, that really transformed the way what they understood about the organization. They were now educated on the work that the Main Street organization did. So it kind of changed that relationship. That will not happen with everyone. There will be people who are like, I'm not even coming to the meeting. And that's fine. You ultimately just have to give them the option. But you might have some that you change their mind and you can actually get them to start thinking in a different way. And sometimes it's just because they start to feel valued, like they were heard. And so it's really powerful. And that's really what this first part of it is, just that inspiration phase of like, let's just understand what's happening. This one I'm showing you here is, I think, really helpful in like a problem solving setting. So if you're facing a problem downtown that you want to bring people in to start kind of getting some ideas out there of how to fix the problem, this is a really good kind of like process to use, because again, understanding what is the problem, how does this problem affect you, how is it impacting your everyday, what have you observed with this, kind of again gaining that point of view. And then that leads really well into ideation, which then this is kind of where I think what I've seen, at least of Main Street organizations, that this is what we do, we tend to do well, is we do ask people, what are your ideas? So I've seen a lot of you do the, sticky notes on what could you imagine this building to be, or what would you want to see downtown? And that is amazing, by the way. Those types of projects, I think they always go over really well, because again, people love to feel like, wow, maybe like my voice was heard, even if it was just me writing on a sticky note. So keep doing those, by the way. Those are great. And I think they're a really good way, again, to engage the community and the kind of work that you're doing in more of a broad scope kind of way. But this is kind of more, again, getting specific, really bringing in a lot people in for like a specific issue or a project. And so the ideation, I think, is where things tend to kind of to flow. And hopefully by this point, you've done a lot of the listening so that the ideation phase feels really natural, where it's like, okay, now we can kind of start to think of some of those, dream a little bit, think of what could those murals be, where would they want to go, and then start to even think through, okay, maybe we could throw up the like prototype in the test phase, is actually thinking through like, okay, what if we tried, maybe did like a faux mural, or put something up and see how that looked, or like, if someone's like, well, I'm kind of open to it on my building, but I feel nervous. Again, it's all about kind of testing, being willing to not rush into a project right away, but instead say, well, maybe what could we try? Again, with a problem solving scenario, this fits really well, because it's like, we're going to just try out some different solutions. We're not going to say that, okay, this is the solution. We don't know that yet because we haven't tried it. So that's really where that testing phase comes in. And then the implementation, once you've actually found something that you feel like helps the situation some way, or it's a project that you feel like we've gained the input, we know what people are wanting. We did the best to bring that together the best we could with what we know, using our professional knowledge also is the right thing, because that's important too. There's a balance there. And so then you can actually put it into place. There's a lot of storytelling around it. You're going to pilot it out. And then you're going to have a model for this, and you're going to be able to hopefully do it again, or, whatever that might look like. So this is just one example. Again, I'm not an expert. There's a lot of different facilitation and community engagement skills and processes and all of that out there. And so if it's something that you're interested in learning more about, I'm happy to send some of the things that I've been reading to people, but it's just something that I wanted to get you all kind of thinking about. Again, as you're thinking, how could our community meetings look different? How can we get input in a way that actually feels effective or feels like we're getting somewhere? And the thing I like about the design thinking process is, again, it gives people some sense of ownership. So you feel like you're leaving with something like that you're going to that's actually going to be implemented. Because so often people, again, if they just fill out a survey, they're like, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen with that survey that I just filled out. I'll never know if that actually had an impact, or that if my opinion or my voice actually mattered. Unless you're really good about following up with surveys, which if you are, that's great. And that's wonderful. But this really gives people some sense of like, I got to be a part of that decision. I got to be a part of something that's going to be in our community for a long time, or is going to really help our community grow. And that's really powerful. For them and for you, because it's only going to make your work more effective and impactful. So when you're facilitating discussions, these types of discussions, you're also creating a connection with your Main Street organization. And so this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, with kind of being that community partner and connector space. And so that's really the goal. Again, your focus is downtown. I'm saying community as a whole, but your focus is downtown. But as people are, again, your stakeholders, even residents who maybe live downtown, or even if they don't live downtown and they come to your events or whatever it might be, they feel like they have this sense of, I know Main Street is an open place for me to come share my thoughts. And I'm sure many of you are like, oh yeah, don't worry. They share our thoughts with us very often. And I know sometimes it's not always fun hearing everybody's thoughts, but I will say, if that's you and that people feel comfortable reaching out to you, and they feel like they can come and say, hey, this is impacting me in a negative way, that is a good thing. That means that they feel like you're going to listen to their voice. I mean, this is exactly why we say, go and do walks around your town, your downtown, and talk to your businesses and just ask how they're doing. We say that because that's a part of community engagement. You're engaging them, you're saying, how are you? Do you need anything? How can I support you? And that creates rapport, and it creates an opportunity for them to say, actually, I know that like the street's closed because of this construction, but I'm feeling a little bit frustrated because my sign keeps getting torn down by the construction crew, and that gives you the ability to say, okay, I will do what's in my power. And again, you're just creating this sense of like, I heard your voice, I'm going to actually do something with you about it versus, again, kind of just making decisions and not having that open line of communication. So if you are going to have some of these community meetings centered around certain projects you're doing, or maybe you do this when you're kind of looking at next year's work plan and you're wanting to bring in some different voices of community priorities, meet in a neutral, comfortable space. So try to remember that especially if your Main Street organization is housed in your like city hall or like a government space, try to go somewhere different. Go to see if a restaurant would be willing to book out a room for you, or go to a coffee shop or somewhere where you can just have these conversations and people will feel comfortable. Sometimes people just don't feel comfortable coming to City Hall. It feels intimidating. Again, you have to think of people beyond your classic 10 people that you talk to a lot. Think of maybe the other people who are like, maybe have never been to a community meeting, or this is new to them, or, where would be a comfortable space for that to happen. Practicing and honing in on your facilitation skills. I mentioned earlier that there might be some topics that you say, I think that we're just too biased to help facilitate this conversation. I think it needs to be somebody else. And so that might mean leaning on, maybe you have a local university who has some students who are skilled in facilitation, or you I don't know, you find a partner or somebody who has some facilitation skills, or a local consultant who'd be willing to do it for you at maybe a lower price or something, but someone to kind of come in and help lead some of these conversations, even just being a neutral facilitator. Or maybe there's someone on your board who says, hey, I think I can lead it neutrally and I have the facilitation skills. But if it's something that you want to grow in, there's a lot of even great like free trainings, books out there to learn how to be a good facilitator. I think the best kind of facilitators, they learn how to just step back and let yes, they lead, they guide, they help create boundaries, but they let the conversation go where it needs to go. And sometimes that's hard, again, especially when it's around a topic we might care about. So definitely be thinking about how can you be practicing or honing in on those facilitation skills. And then maybe even thinking of partners to come and do this if you feel like it needs to be another voice maybe leading the conversation. And then lastly, to education, have education as a focus. So yes, you might just be facilitating a conversation, trying to get input on a project, but also use this as the opportunity to educate them on Main Street. So some of these people they might never, again, and we talked earlier about perception problems. Maybe this is their first time downtown in a really long time, and they didn't know that you were working on doing facade grants and that you did all this stuff for businesses, and they might be like, oh wow, I wasn't aware of that. And so use it as an opportunity just to educate them a little bit about the work that you do. With saying we're always looking to improve, we're always, but this is kind of what we've already been doing in this area. Were you aware of that? Using it as an opportunity to educate them. And then hopefully if you've created some good rapport with them, again, like I said earlier, maybe they will become a volunteer for you, or become, even just an advocate for you, because it never hurts to have more people in the community who are advocates, and supporters of you. So yeah, don't be afraid to also, have some education in there as well. I think that's important for business owners too. If you're coming in, if you're bringing a bunch of business owners in to do like an educational workshop with them, or maybe you're doing some education as well as kind of using some of that time to get input or feedback about what they need. Great time to kind of just tell them a little bit about what Main Street is again, why you're there, just kind of reminding them of that. Um, the other thing that which some of you might have heard of this kind of concept too, but when I've been thinking about this conversation, we got to go to a Ball State training not too long ago where they talked a lot about this concept of kind of these like red dots, which are some of these people in your community again who might not get the opportunity to get to always be at all of those tables where decisions are made. And so, it's pretty typical for like a Main Street, a community foundation, an EDC, the municipality, some of those leaders of those organizations to get to be at the table, again, to make some of these sometimes large scale community decisions. But when we're making those decisions, it can be, again, really important to bring in those other voices. And so, one of the things I would encourage you to think of it is think of, okay, if that's kind of the blue dots, those kind of classic people, I keep saying kind of the same 10 people, start to think of who would they know, who would their board members know, who would their committee members, their volunteers, and start thinking out beyond just, again, that group, and start thinking what are parts of the community that we're not currently engaging in these conversations, that their voice would be really important, and how can we connect them. And so it might not be through you. You might have to, again, go reach out to someone else who knows that person and say, hey, we really would love to get them at a meeting to kind of hear their input on this project. Would you be able to connect me, or would you be able to invite them? But start thinking of those red dots, because if we can start bringing them into the conversation, again, that creates a lot of really powerful change. It creates leaders in your community. It creates more of that ownership of like the work, my voice is being heard, and the work that we're doing here matters. And it really is a grassroots effort. We need everybody, not just some people. And so definitely something I would think about is maybe who are those red dots? Who are people that have a lot of leadership potential? Maybe there's people you're like, I think they would be so impactful, but maybe that currently they're just not being tapped into, or they don't get the opportunity, or maybe they're a little bit nervous about doing it, or they don't show up at things. So maybe there's a new way you need to approach them. But just be thinking about, some of those red dots and how you can maybe start engaging them. And this is a conversation that we'll keep having. I know as I continue to learn and kind of find more ways to approach this, I will share them with you all, because and if you have them that you would like to share with me, please do. Again, this is more of a philosophical conversation today, where I just want us to be thinking about this. But also remember that there's a difference between community outreach and community engagement. Both aren't bad necessarily. Like, both aren't bad. Community outreach is not bad, but there is a difference between just doing outreach and actually engaging. And so some of those differences are community outreach is short term typically, or it's like very kind of spaced out depending on what you need. For Main Street, I would say it's more of a consistent ongoing thing, which is, again, why we're set up so well for community engagement, because engagement's looking at the long term. It's not, again, you're not like, well, we need to figure this out tonight, so let's figure this out. It's like, nope, we're going to try things, we're going to implement ideas, we're going to get feedback. It's much of a long-term thing, which is good, because Main Street is long-term as well. It's not an overnight thing. Community outreach is kind of looking at marketing, whereas community engagement is actually looking at relationship building. So yes, marketing is a great start, but then you want to actually start building actual relationships with people so that they can feel comfortable to come and have their voice heard. Community outreach is looking at things like, what can the organization do for the community? Or vice versa. But then community engagements, what can the organization and community accomplish together? So again, with, not for, so we want the with. What can we do together? Community outreach, sometimes one group benefits the most from this, but community engagement is trying to see how can the whole community benefit from this. And that really means the whole community. And again, so sometimes that's hard because it changes our plans. We might have a certain idea of the way we want to do something, and then we engage the community on it, and it's like, actually, this is going to go a different direction. And that might be hard to let go of sometimes, but it's also important to be open to. Community outreach sometimes can be transactional, whereas community engagement is connecting. So again, sometimes when we think of, we're just doing things for them, versus we actually just want to connect with them and specifically for Main Street, connect them to downtown, make them feel like this is a home for them too, to come and shop and be and potentially live, and all of those things we desire for our downtowns. Community engagement can help achieve that. And then community engagement is cyclical, whereas community outreach is more directional. So I think, again, sometimes it can get kind of like it is kind of linear in the community outreach, like we just need to get this out to people, versus community engagement's always kind of going and it's never really stopping. We're continually finding ways to connect and engage with them. So there's lots of different examples out there. I know we're kind of running, I'm getting close to time. So I'm not going to dive into all of these and I'll send these out in my follow-up email. Don't worry. But I am attaching Liz's website, who I mentioned earlier. If you go into some of her case studies, they're incredibly inspiring to read about, but also just really, really cool to see the ways that she kind of brings in also some different social issues and the way that those are impacting communities with also some of these large developmental projects and the way that she engages neighborhoods and people to help have those conversations. There's some good case studies on Community Innovation Lab. And there's so many examples out there too. If you even were to get on to The Point or even look around our own communities, there's some really powerful examples of the way that people find to connect with their community and really try to have their voices heard. And I love this picture because this is kind of what we typically think of, right? So there's like sticky notes and people are thinking and they're talking and there's a lot of open conversation and again, making people feel like, okay, I got to be a part of that decision. And so that's really what this is all about. So with that, I'm going to quickly move back here, stop sharing my screen. Okay. I'm just going to check the chat here. Make sure I didn't miss anything. Carrie from Pendleton said design thinking. I love this stuff too. Yes, I love that. And then City of Aurora is discussing rebranding. MSA helped in reaching out for opinions through Instagram, Facebook, mass email with the link to the SurveyMonkey. The city felt we had a great response. Yeah, that's a great example, Nancy. I think of really, again, like I think surveys can be really helpful. And so please don't hear what I said when I was talking about surveys earlier. I think the biggest thing is really finding a way to communicate with the public of, hey, we heard what you said in these surveys. We heard, kind of what you desire, what you're wanting for the community or for this rebranding. Here's kind of where we're going. And I think the next part of that sometimes is saying, here's kind of what we're proposing and then gathering more input on that. So I think sometimes there's limitations to things. I understand that. These are just thoughts, but that's good. Beth from Richmond said our monthly business group meetings, we have discussions or we just stop in and talk one-on-one. Yeah, that's great. I think I've heard a lot of you talk about how impactful those business kind of like monthly check-ins are where you kind of let them all come together. And sometimes they might turn into like vent sessions, which again, that's where facilitation skills really can come into play because you can actually kind of help, if you feel like the venting is kind of getting out of hand month to month, maybe start finding some more specific ways and saying, hey, at this meeting, our goal is to kind of talk about this problem, or maybe this is a problem we're hearing you all talk about. How about we do some problem solving, figure out if there's a way to address this, and maybe as the main street, we can bring that to the city and kind of start to think through some other options. Abby said, when you want to get community input, how do you go about doing that? What methods do you use? Something that worked well or didn't? It's a good question. So I feel like when we're actually like talking about getting community input, again, all the things I kind of talked about, like I think there are a lot of different mediums to go about that or methods to go about it. And obviously I didn't have enough time today to dig into like all of them, but I think the best thing to do is start with what your actual goal is. So if your goal is going to be like, for example, the mural project that I gave an example of, I think that for that, it is effective to actually have like a sit down meeting where you're actually kind of letting people ideate and share opinions and perspectives. But then I think there's things like if you're doing a citywide, like what Nancy was saying, citywide rebranding, maybe it makes sense to start with kind of a general survey, kind of start to get people's thoughts, and then maybe you do a follow-up meeting with a more specific focus group. So I think it really depends. And if any of you ever want to brainstorm, if you have a problem that you're like, we want to get in community engagement on this, but We don't know the process. Again, I'm no expert. I think our team would always be happy to kind of brainstorm with you. What would be a way to maybe do this in your specific community for this specific thing that you're trying to achieve, that might be helpful. So that's just some examples. Um, Abby also said, if you are a community going through the transformation strategy process, don't be afraid to share the survey feedback info and how the organization is progressing. Yes, thank you for sharing that, Abby, because that is so like that, those survey results are really, I think, really powerful to share. Again, sometimes it's easy for us to get stuck on the negative parts, but I think you should say, hey, we heard you, and here are the kind of the things we gathered. First of all, here's our strategy. I think that's important. Make sure you're sharing that out. But then, yeah, talk about here's the actual items, because you have your work plan. So it's great. You have all those items. Here's how we're actually kind of addressing this and how we're progressing and wanting to like help implement this. So yes, that's wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. I know I was talking a lot at you, so I definitely, if this is a conversation I want to keep talking about, and I think as we continue to kind of dig into some different approaches and methods, we will share with you. But I will let you go since it's 1 o'clock. Reach out again if you want to talk more. I'll share this on the YouTube page, send a follow-up email, all those good things. And yeah, have a great rest of your Monday. Thank you, everyone.